webinar series in which we at JFF feature some of the hot off the presses early findings from some of our research teams. We're super thrilled today to be presenting to you some of the initial findings from the High Tech High Graduate School of Education's Improvement Science Study that has been underway for the last approximately 2 years. Today, we have the pleasure of having the presenters be Dr. Daisy Sharrock and Dr. Stacey Caillier from the High Tech High Graduate School of Education. I'll be introducing them in a moment. But just real quick before we start off, just a couple words about the Research Collaborative. If you're new to this webinar, we invite you to see some of the many other webinars that we have hosted that are on our website, students@thecenterhub.org and researchcolab.org. We are trying to do our best to catalyze, to communicate, and to connect the field of student-centered learning in order to build the evidence base for greater equity and greater scaling and implementation of best practices. Part of the work that we do is to sponsor research and to translate that research for multiple stakeholder audiences, and today is an example of that work. We are lucky to be funded. Our anchor funding comes from the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, who have long supported this work across the field and have been helping us to build the evidence base for years now. We're grateful to the work that Nellie Mae does for us and in support of us. We are also supported by Overdeck Family Foundation, who provided funds to help us support the improvement science studies over the last 2 years, and this High Tech High study is one of those 2 studies. So really cool stuff that you're going to learn today about the extent to which we can support students' ownership and agency, particularly around issues of math learning in school settings. I'll put a plug in that the full and findings and complete findings for this study will be released at our October convening, October 10th through 12th in Providence, Rhode Island. A save the date has been issued about that. If you did not receive that save the date and you're on this call today, please ping us at the Research Collaborative, and we would love to send out a save the date to make sure that you get an invitation to attend. It'll be a big public event in Providence, Rhode Island, where all of the research studies will be unveiled, and a new set of research studies and a new set of distinguished fellows, and our outgoing distinguished fellows will be presenting their finalized work or their plans for their next project. So we're looking forward to that event in October. All right, with no further delay, I want to introduce 2 of some of the best colleagues we've ever had to work with in the Research Collaborative, Stacey and Daisy from the High Tech High Graduate School of Education, who will take it away, and then we'll have opportunities for Q&A through the chat function and other ways toward the end of the presentation. So thank you, Stacey and Daisy. Take it away.
Great, thank you. So we are, and Eric's totally one of the best colleagues we've worked with. Also, everybody at JFF, for sure. It says that on our whiteboard. I don't know if people can see. So we are really excited to be here and sharing what we've learned and what we've done around improvement science to support student-centered practices in math, specifically focused on elevating student agency and student success. And go ahead. And here's who we are. You already know that, so we're going to keep right on going and say just a little bit about, we both work in the Center for Research on Equity and Innovation at the High Tech High Graduate School of Education. And the graduate school is the first in the country to be fully embedded in K-12 schools. So we actually are watching middle school soccer happening right outside our window right now. We have 13 schools that are part of the High Tech High network. We have a graduate school, a teacher credentialing program, and we have our research center. And the schools themselves are entirely project-based, very student-centered, and diverse and integrated by design. We're a zip code-based lottery that ensures that our demographics mirror the surrounding community, and that's really important to us. So,
yeah, great. So 2 years ago, thanks to JFF and the generous funding from Nellie Mae and Overdeck Foundation, we were able to start our mathematical agency improvement community. And it was a network of 40 to 60 K-12 teachers and participating administrators from 9 of our high schools and 8 schools from neighboring districts. Next slide. Thanks. And the focus of our network was around student agency, which we conceptualized as students feeling a sense of belonging, having a growth mindset around mathematics, and valuing what they were learning. And one of the things that we were careful to do is we didn't want to locate that with the student necessarily. We really wanted to create an environment where the students felt a sense of agency. So our network essential question was, how can we create a learning environment that really nurtures student agency and success? Next slide. And we based our network off of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement Breakthrough Collaborative Model, which focuses on a series of action periods situated between in-person convenings. So we had 3 two-day in-person convenings per year, and in between those convenings we held virtual meetings where teachers got together in small groups and talked about which practices they were testing. And then when we met, we would dig into data and a number of other things that we are going to go through in a second. So next slide. One of the pieces that we were really conscientious to focus on was improvement has a lot of tools that people have access to, but our friend Joe McCannon from the Billions Institute highlighted this for us, and it really rang true, which is that the importance is in using the tools collaboratively and how to use them in relation to one another to learn from each other. So our networks have really focused on building that teacher collaboration. Next slide. This is a busy slide. This was our one of the iterations of our original driver diagram. So you can see our aim was that by June 2018, we'd have 80% of traditionally underserved students in our participating classrooms demonstrate increased mathematical agency and success. When we presented this driver diagram to the teachers in our network, we really wanted to anchor it around, like, how are students feeling that sense of belonging? How are they, demonstrating that they've got a growth mindset, and are they finding value and purpose? So you can see our primary drivers aligned to those aspects of how we conceptualize student agency. And then we highlighted the practices and the places in the classroom that we thought, as teachers, we could attend to those pieces. And this driver diagram iterated. So this is, yes, go ahead, thank you, Melanie, to the next slide. So this is our current incarnation of the driver diagram that will guide our work next year. And so in this one, we've actually more clearly called out that we're interested in building student-centered pedagogy, how can leadership help shape the path, and then the aspects of the curricular design. So moving forward, one more. Thanks, Melanie.
Great. So now we're going to share a little bit about what we actually did when we got together before we get into our findings. And so one of the things that was at the forefront of the work at High Tech High, I think we really involved students from the beginning, not as an afterthought. And there were 2 ways in particular that we really tried to engage students in this work. One was at the very beginning. Our first convening, we had teachers do empathy interviews with students about their math experiences. We also had teachers interview each other about their math experiences. And that was a really great way of doing kind of that root cause analysis, understanding what is the problem we need to address if we want to support student agency and success. And it also was a huge thing for building investment in teachers around this issue, because nothing does that better than talking with students. And then we also engaged, we've been doing a lot of lesson study. Daisy's going to talk about that a little bit later, but part of that involved anticipatory planning. So actually doing some math together, anticipating student thinking and misconceptions, and designing the instruction. And we involved students in that anticipatory planning phase because we wanted them to essentially be collaborators in doing the math and helping us think through where our students going to get tripped up. And that was fantastic. We definitely want to do more of that. Next. We also thought when we started the network, it was really important that we didn't want to just get 60 people in a room and say, what do you think? What should we do to support student agency, guys? We really wanted to give people a place to start. We didn't need to recreate the wheel. There's lots of great practices that are evidence-based, that have been researched. What we did need to know was which of those practices got the most traction and how could they be adapted around in different contexts. And so we actually started with a preliminary change package, or a set of practices that we thought were super high leverage, that we wanted people to experience and then opt in to test in their own context. And these were some of the practices, but the big buckets were that we were aiming to shift mathematical discourse and assessment to be more student-centered. And I'll just highlight this top one with a big shift, kind of taking people from that I do, we do, you do structure that's super common in a lot of math classrooms to more of a you, y'all, we. So kids are having a chance to grapple, share their thinking, and then discuss all together, essentially flipping that structure. We did a lot around creating inclusive, equitable learning communities, around supporting group work, and then we had interventions that were specifically targeted to foster those growth mindsets. Maybe we'll show one of them later. Or Eric can show it. Eric can do it now. We also thought it was super important, you know, teachers are intellectuals. They're in this work because they care about kids, but we also love to think, and we wanted people coming away from this network with a clear sense and confidence in, I can do these practices, this is part of how I teach, and I can also articulate the why behind why I'm doing what I'm doing. So we spent every convening, we would have pre-readings, we would dig into those readings using protocols. These are a couple of the texts and research that we just return to over and over again because they really guided our work.
Since we are a project-based school and firmly believe in the power of doing, one of the structures in our convenings was to do the math together.
Next slide.
Next. Thank you. Right, do the math. So we focused around creating.
Eric's trying to do the.
Exactly.
You almost got it, Eric. How many people at home are trying to do this right now?
We'll teach everybody. So one of the ways that we created a common experience to for teachers to anchor on was by doing the practices that we highlighted in the change package together as students, and then debriefing what the teacher moves were as a group. And this really provided a concrete way to identify with a new way of teaching in a student-centered fashion that's different than what we probably all traditionally grew up with. So you can see some pictures there. The other thing that, thanks, yeah, great, Melanie. The other thing that we explored as a group was the idea of how social dynamics affect learning in classrooms, and in particular, the idea of status. So if you can consider these two scenarios, imagine that you are at your birthday party and all your friends arrive and you are the center of attention and everybody laughs at your jokes and they all want to hear what you have to say. And you feel pretty good about yourself and you have access to all sorts of things in that kind of context. And in a new situation, next slide, you arrive at somebody else's birthday party and you're a friend of a friend and you don't know anybody, right? And so you're just sort of watching the dynamics go on. You're not the center of attention. You're the same person, right? But your status in those two different scenarios is very different, and therefore your access to the learning and engaging with people in those scenarios is very different. And the same thing happens in classrooms. So next slide. So one of the pieces that that teachers were focused on was how to skillfully use status treatments and interventions. So when students are working in groups, if status dynamics are happening where somebody seems to have high academic status and other kids are like, well, they're just going to solve the problem and I'm not, how could we use classroom structures to call out the mathematical thinking of some of those other students that felt like they didn't have high academic status in that group? And so that's noticing that the competent move, questions that they asked, and other ways to highlight their brilliance. So next slide. The other piece that we used a lot in our networks was protocols for guiding our work together. We really wanted to focus on, since we were focused on equity within our classrooms, we also wanted to focus on equity within the network. So how could we ensure that all teachers had a voice as we were learning about these practices? And one of the ways that we use protocols is, next slide, was for doing video analysis practice. We had teachers bring in clips of discussions or group work and look for opportunities where they could pause the video and engage in status interventions. And the other place where we used a video protocol was around teachers bringing in snippets from their classroom discussion and identifying places where they could really slow down and dig into the mathematics and encourage students to talk to each other about what was being discussed in class, which are often hard to do on the fly and much easier to do when you can pause the video and think of what you would say. And then the next slide. The other thing that we did at our convenings was engage in lesson study. So as Stacey mentioned earlier, we got together in groups and anticipated student thinking, and then we would decide on what the focus teacher was interested in collecting data around, which strategy were they testing, and how could we as observers help collect that data. And then we engaged in the lessons and then debriefed next steps. And this was one of the most effective ways for us to do our PDSA cycles because we were all engaged in the process and the learning was communal. And next slide.
Great. And then one of the things that we also wanted to surface just as part of this work, again, was which of these practices are really getting traction and how are they being adapted to different contexts. So we developed a structure that we called a practice mingle that we ended up doing quite often, and that's happened now at other of our networks, where essentially people who are testing the same change idea get together and they share, you know, what are the successes you experience, what are the challenges you experience with this strategy, and how did you adapt it to meet the needs of your students. And from that, we were able to take our original, you know, preliminary change package and really refine it to include those adaptations and kind of like pitfalls to avoid and make them ultimately more useful to teachers. And that was also a great way of synthesizing the learning and essentially engaging teachers in doing that data analysis for us and with us, because we didn't want it to be a situation where we're just throwing out a survey and then sitting in an office doing coding, like, no, let's engage teachers and actually, like, let's co-analyze this together. And the side benefit is that they all walked away with some really great tips to address their challenges and ways that they could adapt it for their own students from others. So that's one example. We also, you know, part of improvement is knowing how do you know you're actually improving? Like, how are you assessing your progress? And how are you using data to guide your next steps? One of our goals from the beginning was to make data feel very safe, feel very useful, and feel very manageable. And so our goal throughout, we looked at data at every convening. We were always looking at network data from our various surveys, and we were also giving teachers time with a buddy to unpack their own personal data related to the surveys that we were using as a network. But our goal was always keep it simple. Bare minimum, whatever is going to be most useful for driving instruction the next day. So that was our mantra. Poor Dwight. Feelings were so hurt. And then we also had the goal of, both of us have participated in networks that have been very teacher focused, which is super important and awesome. We wanted to be very teacher focused, but we also wanted to engage leaders in the work and have them in the room so that they could be shaping the path for this work to happen in their schools. I think what was transformational for a lot of teachers being part of this work is that we were essentially learning how to teach in a way that none of us had ever been taught. And doing that takes a lot of support from the leadership at the schools to just understand what we're after and also be able to make room for that work to happen. And so we did several things to kind of engage leaders around shaping the path and even just get them in the same room sharing dilemmas about how it's going and get feedback from each other. And that's something we definitely want to do more of and could do better. Mm-hmm. So that's a growth area for sure.
And so some preliminary findings. Next slide. Again, we were really interested in, of these practices that we identified as potentially high leverage, which ones were getting traction from the teachers. And so as we switch from this I do, we do, you do to this launch, explore, discuss type lesson structure and using group work in an effective way, we reached out to our teachers and are really happy to see that a number of them feel like they are using these practices on a really regular basis, which is great. Next slide. And the other one was identifying, so if you're trying out these practices, how how is it feeling? Do you feel comfortable using them in your classroom? And the most recent survey data that we collected at the last convening indicates that the vast majority of our teachers are feeling comfortable implementing these practices. Next slide. And the other piece that we were really heartened to see was in the quotes that teachers, the feedback, the qualitative feedback that teachers gave at the end. And this particular quote hits on this idea of, like, a lot of times we have a vision for our math classroom that's student-centered, and students are really engaged in discussing math concepts and digging into, you know, the details in the learning, but we really don't have the tools to make that happen. And so the focus of this network has really been about, like, what are the concrete tools and practices that you can take in the classroom and use to make that vision a reality. And we got some positive reinforcement that that is indeed how this teacher felt, which was great. And another highlight is a lot of the pedagogical tools that we were focused on are not actually just math specific. You know, in humanities classes, we also want to support students feeling academically successful and able to participate in conversations and feel like they have status. So that was heartening too, that these are being spread beyond just the math classrooms.
And we did choose these quotes because they're representative. Not,
yes.
We promise we didn't cherry pick the top 2 that we thought were so great.
We actually had to narrow down the process, so, which was great. Next slide. And so 2 of the structures that we used to assess student agency, one was the Student Agency Improvement Community Survey from the Carnegie folks who run the SAKE network that assess student agency around that belonging, growth mindset, and relevance. And so teachers gave that to their students at the beginning of the year, at the middle of the year, and at the end of the year. And then we also used some practical measures. Since we were hoping to develop, like, robust classroom discussions, there are 2 surveys from a group at Vanderbilt that focus on middle school math, the Purpose for Whole Group Discussion and the Purpose for Group Work Discussion surveys. And teachers could give these surveys to their kids whenever they felt like it, and then they could look on a data dashboard to see what their kids had responded. And in the preliminary analysis we've looked at, just taking a snapshot of that second incident of taking the student agency survey and some of the questions on the whole group discussion survey, and found that there's a correlation, a significant correlation. So the more students perceive the purpose of classroom discussion to be learning different ways to solve a problem, no one right way, the more likely they are to think that there's no such thing as a math person. And similarly, the more that they view the purpose of discussion is to understand how another student thinks about the math, right? Not just the teacher, but you're really digging into how other people think about the math. Same thing, the more they're likely to believe that anybody can be a math person, which was great. We were looking for where's the concrete data that starts to hold up the idea that it's about the environment you're creating for students, and so we were really heartened by this.
Great. And then we had a few quotes from students that we wanted to share because they just made us so very happy, especially this first one, because this was from a student who did not enjoy math and now loves math. And we love that one of the things she cites as being the turning point for her is being able to feel like she can ask lots of questions and skepticize other people's ideas. And we love that skepticize has become a verb. Everybody's skepticizing each other in this classroom. And I think she makes a really important point about, like, it's not boring because our teacher doesn't come into class saying, we're going to do this, we're going to take notes. And she feels like because of that, she has a lot more responsibility and feels more mature. And then the second one really highlights that idea of valuing lots of different approaches to problems and lots of different ways of thinking about work. And that the purpose of one of the things we wondered is, like, we don't want students feeling like they just have to ask questions because we've given them the sentence starters, we're going to be tracking participation. We wanted them to really feel like they're asking each other questions because they want to understand how another person thinks, not just kind of as an expectation of, like, this is what we do, we participate in this way. And so this second quote made us very happy because it kind of got to that idea of there's a purpose behind asking questions. And this part about, like, being so excited to possibly invent a new method was something that came up in a couple student quotes as like students seeing themselves as the generators of mathematics, which was pretty great. And that also gets to one of the change ideas is essentially tacking on student names next to the thinking on the board as they're sharing. So it literally is you know, like Sally's strategy, Juan's strategy, which is really great in terms of student ownership. Next. And then we also kind of asked, like, what advice would you give to other students? And again, these student quotes just kind of highlight the things that they thought were most important to pass on. Of course, the first made our hearts sing, just like, if you don't think you're a math person, you're completely wrong. I used to think that. Just believe in yourself. And then just the importance of asking lots of questions. I love the 8th grade student said it perfectly. You got the answer, but we're not computers, so why did you get that? There was a lot of kind of like, we always ask why and how and not just what, which is something that often you see in a lot of American math classrooms. Is like, what did you get? What is the answer? So we're really pushing on how and why questions. And then again, our skepticizing as super great skill to have.
And so these are, again, this is just some trends that we definitely need to dig into more, so caveat there, but there seems to be from classes moving where we had full teams, like an 8th grade team or a 6th grade team. These are from schools that are from our neighboring districts, have seen some really positive increases for their free and reduced lunch students. So we still need to collect the data, student level data of the prior year for those first data points. This was pulled off the SBAC, the CASP reporting government site, but so we can match directly student to student, but there's some promising trends that we're really excited about. So. And on the horizon, we are creating videos of the practices, and we'll continue to do so throughout the fall and up to the October launch. We have some final teacher interviews to do, collect that prior SBAC data just to be able to track student growth. We're also diving in on the, in terms of our lesson study, to really focus on student thinking and how can we become students of our students in a real way. And so lesson study at our schools. And we were really excited by a group up in San Francisco who are doing public lesson studies. So we've got 2 dates on the calendar for next year, and we will be doing some public lesson studies around math.
And we attended a lesson study that had at least 150 teachers, parents, watching a 3rd grade math lesson.
It was pretty magical.
Magical. And so
wow.
We want that to happen. We've already, yeah, it's on the calendar, so it's got to happen. Next slide.
And so we put together, this is a website that is under construction. We'll be adding videos to it that you can see right there, the hightechhigh.org/math, but it has a lot of the work from this network is on there, and you can also access all the protocols we used plus many, many more that we use across our organization at the protocols link. So.
Ta-da!
Great. Thanks so much.
Ta-da, indeed. So while I want to invite folks who are attending this webinar to type in their questions for Stacey and Daisy into the chat, and Melanie and I will curate those. While we're waiting for some of those questions to appear, I have a couple questions. One would be about the status differences that you focused on, which I think is just such an crucial extension of classroom pedagogy, content-based pedagogy into a learning environment creation and classroom management strategy, and I love the way that's blended there. Could you say a little bit about what's required to prep teachers, particularly white middle class teachers, to be able to discern and appropriately and effectively respond to status differences in the classroom, and some of the backfilling and supports that might be needed so that that is a productive response in the classroom? Lots of literature out there, and I'm just wondering if you have strategies about that.
Yeah, one of the first things we did was at our second convening, we actually had to math teachers and educators who specialize in complex instruction come in and run a workshop. And again, we did the math together as students while they prompted and recognized when we did something that was mathematical, whether we asked questions, we organized our work in a, in a way that was enlightening, built off somebody else's idea. And after participating in that as students, we then unpacked what does it mean to broaden mathematics. So when we think about what a mathematician does collectively as a network, we started to think about what are the things that mathematicians do and how can we start to recognize those in our classrooms. So whether a student is, creating a model or drawing a picture of what it might be, the asking questions, all those pieces. And we generated lists of things that we could attend to. And then that's where the video analysis helped as well, because it's really hard to have those at the forefront of your mind. So using the protocol in groups with other teachers, looking through a video of group work and identifying the moments like, oh, that would have been a great place to highlight that question that student asked, or highlight, maybe get another student to restate what they were talking about.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we actually reached out to Rachel Locan, who wrote the book on complex instruction and group work with Elizabeth Cohen. And one of the things that she said was the greatest challenge in doing the status work was just kind of honing our skills at recognizing it in the moment and being able to respond real time. And so that was why we designed those protocols, and the power of protocols being portable. Like, our hope was that people wouldn't just do them once in the convening, but that those would become routines that they would take back to their school and at the very least, engage in at the convening. But I think being able to pause the videotape and just practice, like, literally, what would you say to a student, not saying like, well, at this point I would say something like, nope, stop, say it like you would to the student, so that we're actually practicing that language. And then to your point, Eric, about, status does get at equity gaps. And so one of the things that we were really explicit about was when we looked at our data, we would look at data disaggregated by, like, who are we serving well, where do we need to improve. And we also, when we were bringing in research and reading together, we were really mindful about bringing in things that addressed issues of race, issues of class, in terms of opportunities that students are provided, and also outcome gaps that result from those, so that we weren't just thinking about status in the kind of like social and academic, but also bringing kind of the race and class lens to that as well. And
crucial.
We actually had teachers when they were first introduced to that concept literally think of kind of like, who are the 4 students on your mind, and where do they fit in this kind of status quadrant, and think about how that might influence the way you intervene to elevate their status, which was helpful too.
Yeah, the confluence that you bring here from the psychodynamic research of belonging and acceptance and integration and cultural responsiveness, but also paying attention to the classroom management ways that we can create learning environments that provide opportunities for students to push back when there are exclusionary processes that might be happening, or when they're kind of pushing away from the table, and helping teachers to see not just how they would understand that theoretically, but how they would practice those responses and get better and better and better at those to create those learning environments where people really lean in rather than lean back. I just think it's a real powerful confluence here. I want to get to a couple of questions. Some high-powered questions from some high-powered folks here. One is, if you could please talk a bit about how the work that you're describing here integrates with the project-based approach to teaching and learning that is so crucial to a lot of high-tech, curriculum and instructional leadership there. So how does that connect with PBL?
Sure. There's some history on that one. So for a long time, we wrestled with how to integrate mathematics into our PBL culture, and what did the strategies and tools at the classroom level look like to have kids authentically engaging in mathematics in a real way that also still built their conceptual understanding of mathematics. And in lots of cases, you would see folks where we ended up kind of pulling math out and wrestling with it. And in some classrooms, it really kind of went back to a pretty traditional, you know, I do, we do, you do type scenario. And it wasn't until some of our teachers started digging into Joe Bowler's work that the idea of focusing on problems and discussion of the deeper mathematical ideas really did hit at the same values that we held for why we have kids engage with projects. You know, how can we provide access points for multiple students? How can we focus on the student thinking and what students are learning and how they're experiencing the topic at study? And how are there opportunities to connect it to the real world or real world situations that, that they would run into? And so this way of teaching math addressed all of those issues. So, and I almost think that our organization had an extra little barrier there and stumbling block to engaging with this work in a real robust way because of some of our previous ways that we were thinking about mathematics. But there's definitely been a lot of movement there.
Nice. Great. Second question, what percentages of students were underrepresented students of color across your sample? And if you could you say something about their responses to these interventions, whether there were academic measures of growth or other forms of growth that you were able to capture? And then also, if you might talk a little bit about the diversity among the teachers who participated. So more of the demographics across your sample, that'd be great.
Yeah. The student demographics range from, I think, in some of the neighboring districts, like 60% students of color all the way to higher, you know, 75, 80% students of color in the participating schools. And in terms of teacher demographics, I would say we're probably majority white, but definitely not entirely.
Yeah. We haven't actually processed the teacher demographics
yet.
Yeah,
that would be interesting.
That's a good question.
So pretty consistent with the demographics across public education in the U.S. here, so not non-representative there.
Yeah. And in terms of the getting some insight into the student experience, one of the pages on the website actually has some video of student testimonials that represents a good wide range of students, and so I totally recommend checking those out. And we pulled some of the quotes in our presentation from there, so, and they're just lovely to hear. So.
I bet. Another question from an attendee who is curious about how this information is incorporated into students' performance assessments and whether this information is shared with parents, families, and caregivers during teacher conferences at some point. And if so, if you can characterize how that's communicated, that would be really cool to, I think, to know more about.
That is a fascinating question. I'm not entirely sure whether like the agency data or the purpose of classroom discussion data was shared explicitly with parents. What I do know is that a number of teachers in our organization and others have hosted parent nights around this type of mathematics to try and bring them in as collaborators and understanding of what we're trying to do. And that has been really well received. One of our participating teachers also hosted, we do exhibitions of student learning in our organization, so she actually had her students facilitate an open-ended math problem where their parents came and worked in groups and compared strategies for solving it, and they facilitated the whole event, which was a big highlight. So.
That would be fun to see.
Yeah.
So I would encourage you as you think about finalizing some of these findings for other audiences, it seems like the connections to other known successful features of the high-tech high, whether it's problem-based or project-based learning, the way that you engage parents and families and community members, and how you do that and how this work gets kind of filtered through and expressed in those arenas, I think would be some more value add for various audiences who are looking to implement some of your practices. So I encourage you to think about that. Another question, Melanie, if you could go to the student impact slide that was a ways back, that one, thank you so much. I'm struck by the simplicity and the power of the two things that are on this slide. And I'm particularly struck by how the strategies that are suggested here are not restricted to mathematics learning at all. So I'm wondering if you might dig a little bit deeper into how you see the insights in those two bullet points moving into science and the humanities classes, and heck, go to PE if you can. Like how does this impact the way that we think about driver strategies that produce really great social, emotional, academic, belonging, school climate outcomes with sort of a small nudge, big impact across other domains here? Can you comment about that?
I'm so glad that you are struck as strongly as I was when I dug into the data and found this. I think it's just really heartening to understand that when we are connecting students to each other and having them recognize the strengths and thoughts and ideas of each other, that impacts, how they see the potential for themselves. And I think that does have tremendous applicability across all disciplines. I'm really excited, especially about that teacher that said we're sharing this with our humanities teachers as well, because classroom discussions around humanities and attending to how are we understanding and making sense of other students thinking around these themes and ideas we're digging into our readings would be incredibly powerful. So.
Yeah, and it's stuff we have a literacy collaborative that we launched this year in our high-tech high schools. It's going to be continuing on next year, and it's guided by a lot of this work. For years, we've been doing Socratic seminars, and we're constantly thinking of ways to facilitate more student-led discussions. But having this kind of evidence crop up for the importance of kind of cultivating those types of discussions where kids aren't just kind of like rotely participating, but actually see a real purpose behind participating, definitely applies across all disciplines.
And it's no small task, right? That's the other piece, right? Facilitating an effective discussion is a challenge. So we feel like this is promising, like evidence we're moving in the right direction, but now like what are those tools? How are we situating ourselves so we're really paying attention to what students are saying and then getting other students involved in the understanding of that?
Yeah, the second bullet in particular strikes me as a real value add, and when we think about culturally responsive pedagogy and ways to dismantle kind of exclusionary, white middle class dominant ways of understanding who gets to be seen as smart in the classroom. And if the classroom discourse and curriculum is wrapped around making sure that we're adequately engaging and trying to understand another's thinking, the othering process to me would seem to be highly diminished, and we'd have a much more, not just responsive, but a much more invitational and critical and multivocal expression that could be open in the classroom. So I for one see that as there are ways that I think we can make that more explicitly raced and classed and gendered in a way that would match so much of what we see in the literature around oppressive forms of education in the ways that we can have more liberatory practices. So I'm particularly attracted to that second bullet and the possibilities there. Any comments about how you see those connections there too?
No, similar. I see these practices, I think, really do allow students to bring their whole self to the classroom, right? And when we're talking about culturally responsive pedagogy, like these are opportunities where their thinking is honored and respected and, part of the fabric of the learning of the whole group. And I think it's a real key important piece to develop.
And that there's lots of ways to be mathematically smart. I think that's one of the things that we've pushed on. And Soretta Hammond, her work around culturally responsive pedagogy, and she's really strong about this point that culturally responsive pedagogy is about ensuring that like everybody is carrying the cognitive load, that it's not inequitably distributed. And so one of the goals of classroom discussions from the beginning in the network has been how are you ensuring that all kids are participating, that all kids are being kind of elevated and seen as they have something to contribute, and that students are seeing each other as resources in their own thinking. And so, yeah, that applies everywhere.
So to that end, you know, I'm going to ask an extension of this question and sort of put you on the spot a little bit about this one. So some of the pushback that we get pretty routinely when some of these practices are first getting traction in a school or a district is from parents of privilege who don't want their kid, and I'm saying all of this in quotes and knowing that it's problematic, but this is a refrain that you nod because you know where I'm going, who are concerned that if they are placed in a heterogeneous learning environment rather than a track learning environment, that those kids will be dumbing down and they'll have to be teaching those kids that this movement to try to make sure that all learners and the strategies that they bring to a particular learning task are part of the collective understanding of how best to solve math problems, dumbs down the curriculum. How do you assuage that fear, and how do you talk to the parent who says, we don't want to do that? What's your answer there?
Right. So one thing that fear seems to be predominant when you view mathematics as getting the right answer. And so when you see it in that kind of narrow vein of like, how fast did my student gets the right answer quicker, you know, so therefore, by waiting for other people to get the right answer, we're slowing this down. And this type of teaching shifts that completely. It's not about the right answer necessarily. It is about how many different ways of getting to that answer can we all understand deeply. Because therefore, if I can understand your way and you did it differently than me, that's going to add to my understanding of the underlying mathematical concept we're trying to create multiple access points to, right? So like the more I engage in you know, what it means to add two numbers together, what multiplication means in different ways, the more robust of an understanding I'm going to have. And so the idea is creating a classroom culture that honors all students' thinking, that allows us to really deeply understand the mathematical concepts by interrogating each other's ideas, right? And acting as mathematicians would. And so a lot of the work with parents highlights a lot of the work that Jo Boaler has put together, and she's got a lot of resources, which is great. Engaging parents in doing math and honoring the way that each of them see a problem, and so highlighting that experience for them. And we have on our website, I think, some slides from the parent nights that we've held, but just that often just that experience of doing mathematics and then recognizing how somebody else saw the problem and then recognizing that you've learned something additional is a powerful moment, and especially for parents who themselves have had math trauma, so I like to call it.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add, I guess, that this is partly why when our change package of ideas has actually evolved to include a whole section on like how do you engage with parents around these ideas, and part of it is educating parents around like Jo Boaler's work and others and getting them doing the math. Another part is having them actually like think about their own experiences with math, because often the people that are advocating for math to continue being taught as it was didn't necessarily do all that well in math as it was. And so kind of creating those moments of cognitive dissonance. And also, I think the more we can communicate that in math, we are after kids like loving it and feeling like they deeply understand it, which means that they have to have a flexible understanding and be skeptics. That's really different than plowing through worksheets. I know that there may be parents out there that want their kids plowing through worksheets, but when you really talk to them about what they want for their kids and how they want them to experience math, few parents are actually going to say that. But it's just hard to break past that kind of like, but this is what math has been. And students are in that place too. Like there's plenty, often where we get some of the most initial resistance is from those students who have been highly successful in very traditional
environments.
And at the same time, don't have that flexible, deep conceptual understanding that would allow them to really like engage with math in a way they would need to as a mathematician or a scientist, or even just like find the joy and love in it. Do you have an in-depth understanding so you could step out into the real world and engage in a mathematical way?
Yeah. In a world with shifting needs out of graduates and employers, it doesn't, the kind of graduate, the kind of skill sets that might have been okay 15, 20, 30 years ago are not necessarily what is going to be needed a year from now and 10 years from now. So I see a lot of what you're doing is to prepare students for that flexibility and thinking, for multiple ways to solve a problem, for being able to work with and in complex units with deeper learning skills that would prepare them for college, career, and civic readiness. And to that end, I wonder if the flip side of the coin you might address also, that when marginalized and minoritized parents, families, and caregivers express to us and say, you know, I don't want this, and again, I'm saying this in quotes, knowing that it's problematic, but I don't want this wishy-washy stuff that you're doing. I want to make sure my kid knows what they need in order to be successful in a dominant economy and a dominant culture. So don't prepare them with this stuff that won't prepare them to be really successful. How do you then answer the parents that are feeling the potential threat of further minoritization and marginalization through these techniques?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's a real thing. In some of the classrooms where there is a significant saturation of this type of teaching, that you do see pretty strong student outcomes. So it does not appear to be that, like, if this philosophy is embraced by a teacher and they are really working towards it, you know, we've seen evidence from across the network that that they have strong student outcomes on traditional, you know, tests and our CAST scores and that type of thing. I do want to draw a distinction that is different, though, from just trying out a few practices, right? Kids are really good at discerning in a classroom whether what you're saying is aligned to what the practices are that you're doing. And so there's a piece there that I think is important to acknowledge.
Yeah. So the last question I want to ask you is just going back to the operative term here, which I think might be a bumper sticker or a T-shirt or something that we should, I think about broadcasting more broadly, and that's the skepticizing word. I just love that word. So as researchers and as educators and as leaders of a learning community, how is that word operationalizing for you? How are you seeing it used by kids? Give me some background on where that word is moving.
We have to give credit where credit is due. I mean, so much of this work, all of this work has been informed by really awesome teachers. Katerina is one of those, and her students. She uses the language of skeptic that's kind of infiltrated our network.
Yeah, and so her kids in particular, it is a verb. They use it all the time.
It's a role.
It's a role.
It's one of the roles in her classroom.
Yeah, so in the group roles, one of the roles is skeptic, and they provide a really important function, right, because they give permission to ask the nitty-gritty questions that in the sort of a traditional class, you might be like, oh, that's kind of a dumb question, or you're not following along fast enough, or any of those uses, but they give full permission to this person to just be like, why did you choose a 3? And like, where did you come up with that? And why is 2 + 2? Why do you think that's 4? It's like, absolutely skepticize anything, and they embrace it wholeheartedly.
And just this idea that if we were in her classroom for a lesson study a few months ago, and she made a really key point about, you know, if we dismiss other people's ideas, that's showing disrespect. But if we interrogate and critically engage with each other's ideas and essentially ask each other, like, convince me, how can you convince me, that we're really showing a sign of respect for each other's thinking. And that's the kind of culture that she's created in her classroom, and that's the kind of culture we're after across our network.
Nice. Yeah, and to that point about skepticizing and interrogating, you know, we got a question from one of the attendees here to encourage us to think about whether the resistance that we, using the we in a problematic notion, depending on who the we may be here, but the resistance that we get to a lot of these student-centered learning practices in various sectors might be because of who is delivering the message. And we need to be thinking more concretely about how we diversify the field of those of us who are leading the edges of student-centered learning practices and deeper learning outcomes. And I think that question and that push by the attendee is very well put and very well taken. I would point to, it's just a quick plug here, to our new RFP that has been released. If you haven't yet a chance to see that, please go to the Research Collab website and to the Students at the Center Hub website, where it's posted in both places. And you'll see there is a highly weighted category about the researcher and practitioner positionality in that call. We're particularly looking for teams that have enough expertise and experience with personal experience with marginalization and have the expertise to be able to analyze and appraise and then respond to and make meaning of those situations in order to better appeal to audiences that are impacted by the practices we think should best be scaled. So it's an important question. We continue to wrestle with it, much like we're wrestling with the representation across the field, and we welcome insights from folks about how we might best do that. So I appreciate that question. So I'm going to pass this back to you two to just finish out if there's any concluding remarks you'd like to make about the work, where it might be headed next, and then I'll thank everyone and we'll conclude. So last call for you two.
Go ahead.
No, never mind.
It was wonderful to participate in this network, and we're just so thankful that we had the opportunity.
Yes.
So, yeah, thanks so much.
Indeed. We're really excited to see where this work will go in the remaining months. It's exciting to know that you still have some more data gathering and some data analysis, so we're looking forward to seeing how those themes are expanded or tightened. Again, the full release of all studies in the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative will occur at the October meeting, October 10th through 12th at the Providence Biltmore Hotel in Rhode Island. It'll be a big public gathering of researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to make sense of this new research and also see where the research collaborative is going with the next phase. I want to thank Dr. Daisy Sharrock and Dr. Stacey Caillier for this fantastic work and for all of what you do at the High Tech High Graduate School of Education. Want to thank again our funders, the Nellie Mae Education Foundation and Overdeck Family Foundation. And as always, I want to thank Melanie Mulvey for making all of this move so smoothly and so well through its many phases. So thanks to everyone for the attendance. We look forward to more feedback offline. If you have questions or ideas for next stages, please feel free to contact us. And I know that Daisy and Stacey are always interested in more feedback. So thanks for attending today. Have a great rest of the week and stay tuned for more cool stuff. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.